Now, our next witness will be known as AI, follows on in order from AH. And in his case, I make an anonymity order, restriction order in these terms. I order that the name and address of witness W0008, that's AI to you and I, the name of any member of the witness's family and other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of their appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form unless express permission is given by me or by the solicitor to the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness W0008 must be referred to only as Mr. AI. The order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered, and I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. Now, Mr. AI, would you come forward, please?
Okay.
Your name is known to the inquiry. Please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the
whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and
the
nothing
truth.
but the truth.
You were diagnosed with severe haemophilia A when you were a baby in 1980.
Yes,
And you were treated thereafter at the Birmingham Children's Hospital under the care of Dr. Frank Hill until you were 17, and then you transferred to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, also in Birmingham.
that's right, yes.
Now, when you were very young, you had a lot of bleeding episodes.
I did.
I think
Yes.
3 to 5 a week, you've suggested in your
That's right, yeah.
statement.
I would be treated quite often because of multiple problems, often surrounding my ankles to begin with. But as I grew, I had an awful lot of bleeds related to my growing. At the time, we would be having to call ambulances to be taken to the hospital where they would treat me there to begin with, until my mother was introduced to treating me, and later on having to learn how to treat myself.
And your records show that you were first given Factor 8 products in October of 1980, again as a baby. You were given cryoprecipitate for a period between 1981 and 1982, and then back to Factor 8 products.
That's what I'm told my records show, yes.
And then in terms of the home treatment, that began administered first of all by your mother in
Yes.
1986. And by the age of 7, you were...
I started to learn to do it myself as well. During that time, my mother would also be treating me, alternating, because after having the brain hemorrhage I had, I was paralysed down my one side, so I don't have the coordination to do it both ways. So my mother would have one arm, and we'd alternate who did it. So it would be on this day, I would do one, and then my mother would do it 2 days later, let's say, using the other hand to let my veins rest.
Now, were your parents, as far as you're aware, ever given any information or advice or warnings about any risk of infection associated with the use of the Factor products?
No, they were told that what I was on would be heat treated. This is after my cousin had already been infected, and that was in 1984. So after that had happened to our family, both my mother and his mother were told at the haemophilia unit that now they'd started using heat-treated products, and once they started that, they said it was absolutely safe. Things like that couldn't happen again. So at that time, I wasn't infected, and my parents were told it was not possible to be infected once you're using the heat-treated products.
If we just take it in stages, so before heat treatment was introduced, before your cousin was diagnosed, from 1980 up until 1984, when your cousin was diagnosed as having been infected with HIV, you were receiving factor VIII during that time, Armour products,
Yes.
as far as you know.
Yes.
Were your parents told in the pre-heat treatment phase anything about any risks?
I don't know what my parents were told at that stage about potential risks, but I don't believe they were told that they were taking any risks with my health. If they were told anything, they were told it was as safe as it could be. And that's all I've ever been told that that was said to them at that time.
And then, as you've already referred to, in 1984, it was discovered that your cousin, who was very similar age to you, I think 6 weeks older than you.
6 weeks apart we were.
He was 4 at the time, and the family was told that he had been infected with HIV.
Yes.
But you were tested, and at this point, you had not been infected with HIV.
That's right, yes.
The test results were negative.
Yes.
And then, as you've just said...
Sorry, the testing was happening quite often after that stage, once they'd established that some had been infected. I don't know how many other episodes prior to my cousin's infection episode, the incident that infected him, and I don't know how many others it infected at that time, but I don't know how many incidents of other infection times they'd already had. But I do know that from that time onwards, we were being regularly tested. I know this now, and my parents will have been taking me to the hospital after the fact that my cousin was infected. They were obviously furious and then very scared for my well-being. So testing will have been taking place, and for a long time I was clear of the viruses myself. And that's when they were telling my parents that they'd taken the precautions that they needed to. What they were using now was much cleaner and heat treated, therefore it couldn't happen to me after the fact of my cousin's infection.
And what you've said in your statement is your parents were reassured by the hospital that heat treating the blood products was now being done, and so you could never be infected in the same way. The products would be safe and free of viruses.
Yes, that's what they were told. They said the entire point of the heat treating is to get rid of the viruses. If there was ever anything like that in the products, it would kill them.
You had contracted hepatitis B.
Yes.
In early 1985, when you were about four years old, but you naturally cleared that virus.
Yes. That was during the time I was still at the Children's Hospital that I actually naturally cleared it.
And then in around August or September of 1986, your father was told by the hospital that there was a problem
Yes.
with a batch of product.
Yes, that they'd been giving to me, and that they... I don't know how it was explained to my parents. I know that my father wrote at the time about what he'd been told and how they were told. I do know that my mother was told eventually that I was infected over the telephone.
We'll come on to that. Again, we'll take it in stages.
Okay.
Around August of September of 1986, there was a recall of an Armour product,
Yes.
your father was told. And as you say, your father wrote a letter, and we're going to look at that. Paul, it's 0008004, please. We can see the date of it. It's the 14th of November, 1986.
Yes.
It refers to you and you being a severe haemophiliac.
Yes.
And then it says this in the second paragraph: there are over 100 young patients receiving treatment at the Children's Hospital, Birmingham, and each were recalled and tested for the virus. Unfortunately, a large percentage were found to be already carrying the AIDS antibody. It was then announced that the factor VIII was to go through another process by which it was heat treated, and of course we thought our worries were over. Not so. 2 patients were found to have contracted the antibody even after this safeguard. Our fears have returned and we no longer feel secure using the above-mentioned product, which was, the first paragraph mentions it's Armour. And then over the page, your father continues, following this, the hospital called in Armour Factor VIII and we were issued with a product made by Alpha. And then it says, at the present, and names you, is free from the virus, but he has to have fortnightly blood tests to keep check on his condition. Obviously, this lack of guarantee of what is the life-saving product worries us, as you will well imagine. And then if we just go down towards the bottom of the page, it says, your father says this, we understand that we could well produce Factor VIII here in Elstree, but sadly the government fails to fund to a correct level to make this country self-sufficient. Although at present we produce a limited amount, funding to a higher level could give us all peace of mind. Dr. Hill, the head of haematology at the Children's Hospital, says we need urgent resources to fund the following. 1, research to produce a synthetic Factor VIII, which would be 100% safe. 2, for health education. 3, for a counselling service, so necessary, particularly at the present, when all the patients and their relatives are at their lowest ebb. At present, we haven't a single counsellor, either at the Children's or at the Queen Elizabeth, where the young patients continue their screening and treatment after reaching 16 years. We can only wait for our twice-yearly consultation with Dr. Hill. It is quite dreadful that we can't get advice when we are all so anxious. The only way we can get this much-needed chance to talk through a particular problem is through the parents' self-help group. And that, for the sake of completeness, was a letter that was being written to your local MP, Peter Snape. Now, that's 14th of November 86, and up until that point, you had tested negative
Yes.
of the virus. But that changed, and your records suggest that you first tested positive on the 19th of November 1986.
Yes.
Only a few days after that letter
After
was
that.
written.
So they worked out later that it's probable that probably at the time that was being written, I'd already received the treatments that were infected. So my parents are thinking I might have dodged a bullet, if you like, and they're writing with hope. And it wasn't long after that, although I now understand there were unacceptable ways that they found out about the fact that I'd been infected. At that point, they didn't think I had been, and I feel for them.
And your understanding from what's set out in your medical records is that you seroconverted in around November 1986, when you
Yes.
were 6 years old. And critically, at a point in time at which the only product that could have infected you with the HIV virus were the heat-treated Armour products
Yes.
that you had been
At the
receiving.
time, the batch numbers of what I was being treated with were being recorded by the hospital, which I've managed to get a list of to yourselves
You have.
that show that it was those products that I was on at the time. So, as far as I understand it, it could only have come from that source.
And we can see from a statement that your father made in subsequent litigation, call it 008009, please. This is a statement prepared by your father, I think for the purposes of either the HIV haemophilia litigation or litigation that was taken against Armour itself. But we can see about halfway down the page, it says, in about August 1986, I was informed by the hospital that a particular batch of Armour heat-treated product was faulty and that there was some sort of problem. I received instructions from the hospital to return all the remaining supplies of heat-treated Armour Factor 8 to them. After the product had been returned, you, Mr. AI, had to attend hospital approximately once every fortnight for blood tests.
Yes.
My wife has informed me that on one occasion she went to the hospital and managed to catch sight of the file in relation to you. The file indicated that the results of the fortnightly tests had proved negative up until November 19th, 1986, when the word HIV positive was indicated next to the results of the test. We were not actually informed of the position until January 1987. To the best of my knowledge and recollection, the only treatment our son ever received was with unheat-treated and heat-treated Armour Factor 8. He most definitely seroconverted at a time when he was receiving the heat-treated product. That was the statement your father gave in the litigation.
Yes.
The reference to your parents not actually being informed of your diagnosis until January 1987 is a reference to a telephone call your mother received. What can you tell us
Yes.
about that?
My mother, when this was explained to me, when I started to become a lot older, I would be around about 15 to about 17 when I was told more. But my mother explained to me that one of the things that really hurt them and angered them was that she was only told over the phone. And it stressed her massively, to which point they immediately fled up the hospital with me to try and find out what the hell had gone on and how it was that it wasn't just being told over the phone, it was the extent of everything she'd already read. I now understand this information was kept in these boxes for years. And because I was so young, I wasn't aware of all the information found out at the time until much later. And it's only in recent months even that I've ever seen this document from my father's statement. And I didn't know the details of how it was that they were told over the phone. And I didn't know that it was months later that they'd actually been informed that I'd actually become HIV positive. So obviously the more I find out about it, the more upset I become about how they were treated and how they were told what had happened to me. So although I don't know, because I was very young, I was 6. So because I was that young, I didn't know what was happening. And I think my dad references in one of his letters that they didn't tell me that I was HIV positive to try to shield me from the strain of that, given that it's becoming a very famous, deadly disease. And they didn't tell me until I was older. But whilst I'm at school, they were telling me to have to be very careful how I play with other children, trying to move the focus on to, remember, you're a haemophiliac, you might hurt yourself. But I then, later in life, come to understand we're also protecting the other children. And that's why I'm not doing sport or physical activities with the other kids, just in case there is any kind of school ground accidents that would threaten the other kids. So I can imagine they were deeply stressed with wherever I was, whenever I was out of sight.
And you've described it in your statement as you got a little older, your parents essentially broke the news to you in stages.
Yes.
First of all, you've got something in your blood. It means other people can't touch your blood. You need to be very careful when you're playing with your friends.
When I was relatively, at the beginning, I would probably be about 13 when that was proposed to me.
And then they said to you a little later on you needed to be very careful in PE and careful of accidents.
Yes, that would be at school, in junior school. That was when I was younger.
And then you say it was when you were aged sometime between 14 and 16, so your mid-teens, when you finally were informed and understood that you had HIV.
Yes.
You'd also been diagnosed with hepatitis C.
Yes. What I understand of that is I wasn't actually tested and diagnosed until the early 90s. And I understand that, I believe that to be because the testing wasn't available until that period. So although it all stemmed back to the dirty products that we were given, I believe we weren't confirmed as having Hep C until later because the testing wasn't available. That's what, as far as I can recall. I do remember my mother telling me that, but I didn't know what year specifically, whether it was 1993 or 1992, that she remembered that it was asserted when I was finally diagnosed with that as well. What I do remember about that is that she pointed out that my cousin didn't get that, but that may have been because my cousin died in 1992. So when we were both 12. So it may have been that he hadn't had the test yet, but I don't know. I do know that there was something I got, which I believe was the Hep C, that he didn't get diagnosed with. But I think that may be because he died.
And as you said, your cousin died at the age of 12 years old.
Yes.
From AIDS.
Yes, he developed double pneumonia and died because his immune system collapsed.
You yourself, in terms of the hepatitis C, cleared it naturally when you were in your late teens.
Yes, I would have been about 18 to 19 when they told me that, because I know that I'd already transferred to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital by that time, and I didn't transfer to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital until I was 17. It was normal that you went earlier, but because we were haemophiliacs and the bond with where we were being treated was quite strong, a lot of haemophiliacs didn't transfer until they were a little older, so that there was a better picture of where our health was before we moved over. So I will have been 18 or 19 by the time they tell me that I've naturally cleared the Hep C.
There's a long-term health consequence of the Hep C, which we'll come on to at a later stage.
Yes.
You've said in your statement that by the time you transferred to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, you were receiving what you described as a proper education from the hospital about HIV and hepatitis and what it could do, and you understood about transmission and risks of transmission.
Yes.
And you were given, you've said at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, very helpful advice in relation to sexual partners taking precautions, and they were very supportive and didn't try and discourage you from forming normal relationships.
That's correct. Everything that I learned about living with it, and the goal was not to necessarily let it completely destroy your life, came from help I got from both my social worker, which I was put in touch with as soon as I came to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and I'll explain the importance of that later, and also at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, the staff there were used to dealing with the patients as adults, no longer as children, as you would be spoken to at the Children's Hospital. Although they did see us as becoming adults, they'd spent years dealing with your parents and explaining things to them, and then it developed into have things explained together, but they're really more talking to your parents to make sure that it's kept straightforward. At the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, they're immediately speaking to you as an adult, and they did have some significant differences in philosophy as regards how they dealt with you. So you were immediately talked to as an adult, and my social worker's help, because I had a lot of trouble with staying at school and social interaction, was critically important to me. And it was how I understood, how do you live with this deadly virus, and how do you protect other people? And it wasn't just about things like becoming an adult and becoming sexually responsible. It was obviously you fantasize having a bleeding disorder. Any accident like a crash or anything threatens everybody else. So you're always wanting to know the extremes of the precautions you need to take. So we had to learn how to behave as adults with the viruses.
I know you wanted to say a little about your cousin because there's no one else to speak for him.
Yeah.
He was just 12 when he died.
Yeah, he was infected when he was 4 years old. We were both 4. And at that date, they infected my cousin, and he didn't survive that long more than the government's guideline time frame, which was something like 5 years. My cousin made it to 12 years old, and he developed a cold at school, which then developed into a much worse form of flu-like symptoms, and then that escalated into double pneumonia, and that's what he died of. And I do remember both going to the hospital when he was dying and basically being told to say goodbye. And also at school, there was a vigil at the school where everybody was encouraged to hold a candle because my cousin had died and they'd all been told, but obviously not been told why.
You yourself didn't know the exact reasons why he died at the time because you
At the
two
time,
were
I
only
didn't
12.
know what was wrong. But I found out later, you see.
And you found out what he died of at the time you were being told that you had the very same condition.
Yes, I was not told at the time he died that he died because he was HIV positive, because I was also HIV positive and my parents were trying to protect me, but I was told that he died of double pneumonia. I wasn't told why that was. So I knew at that stage that he'd become really ill and died, but I didn't find out until I was older when it's been explained to me that I am also HIV positive, and that was the reason my cousin had died of what he died of. So obviously that impacted me quite hard, because you then think, well, if that's how extreme things can get and how fast it was, what can you do with that? You're just waiting for something random. Because my cousin, it didn't take him long to become that sick. One thing that was the case at that time, I was not on treatment for HIV when I was at the Children's Hospital. And I would believe that that would mean that my cousin wasn't, because the reasoning there was because at that time there were only the very early drugs for the HIV. They would tell us that they would only keep, I found out later in the years, around about the age of 17, that they tended to only keep the treatments for when things got really bad, because they didn't want us becoming resistant to them. That was the mindset of the Children's Hospital. However, when I transferred to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, their philosophy was completely different, and I was put on treatment immediately as soon as I got there. So the difference in the style of the way you were treated was completely different. I don't know whether anything they could have treated my cousin with could have helped him to not become sick in the way he did, because I don't know what of those drugs was available when we were both 12 years old in 92. So, but I do know that if they had anything, is it AZT was the very early form of treatment that they could use. But I think that would be the only thing they could have possibly done to try to help him, but there was nothing they could do to help him at all. His mother was obviously destroyed by that.
You've described in your statement, once you became aware of the diagnosis and you began to understand the implications of it, you put it this way, that you began to build mental walls. You thought
Yes.
you were dangerous and you became terrified of infecting others.
Yes. From initially, because I wasn't sexually active, it was just the point of view of interacting with other people. And one of the things I did do, because I wasn't very capable, but one of the things I did do was I did voluntary conservation work for a short time until the bleeding issues that I got were causing too much trouble and it had to stop. But during one of the episodes I was working with them, I managed to cut my hand whilst we were working on some of the copicing we were doing. And at that time, I remember a medical staff member coming towards me trying to help me, and I ended up kicking him away from me because I was worried about him.
You were frightened that if he helped you, you might infect him.
Well, we'd all been working with tools, so I'm thinking he doesn't know if he's cut himself anywhere, so I'm extreming the situation. I don't want... He wasn't wearing gloves, and I didn't want him messing with me whilst he'd obviously been using the same kind of large blades that we were using on the trees. If he had any kind of cuts on himself, he didn't know that I was HIV positive. I told the office there, and they were aware of it and were comfortable with me working with them, but he himself didn't know. So I kept him away from me the only way I could. But it was basically my own built-up walls and trying to keep it away from everybody else.
And you talked about having a breakdown at the age of 17, and until the age of 24, you became what you've described as a very closed-off person. You didn't leave the house.
I didn't go anywhere. I'd spend almost all my time in one room, and it just was an easier way of dealing with everything. It's already difficult enough for us to socialise with everyone else, given that we're physically going to damage ourselves being haemophiliacs, and keeping up with the normal pace of normal people always injures us. But as I grew up and I start building barriers between me and people, as far as getting girls and girlfriends, there was just nowhere I could go in my mind to justify going along that path. So yes, I became very closed off from everybody, and eventually it was even disruptive to my family.
In terms of the physical effects, you talked in your statement about feeling seriously fatigued all the time, constantly being on drugs with side effects. Can you tell us a little about that?
A lot of the drugs we have to take are very toxic. So you're always dealing with extreme levels of nausea, and we're having to take anti-sickness pills just to combat the nausea, just so that you can eat, because you're endlessly feeling nauseous, but you're also weak and drained because they basically knock you about. It's almost like they toxify you to toxify the virus enough to keep it down. I don't know how it works, but it seems to have to beat you up in order to combat the virus, and I've heard it described many times as like being on a mild form of chemotherapy all the time, because you're so wiped out, you're tired, you feel sick all the time, and it really affects your ability to have any energy whatsoever. And on top of what we're already doing, it just makes life 3 times as hard.
And you had recurrent serious infections that required you to be hospitalised over the years.
Yeah, I had several occasions where I'd have to go into hospital because I developed some kind of lung infection or something similar, where I would be choking up whatever this infection was. But what would often happen, it wasn't every single time, but it often was the case that they couldn't even diagnose it. And the policy at the time, for example, with antibiotics, is if we can't diagnose it, then we can't work out which type of antibiotic you can be treated with, therefore we can't provide you any treatment. So several times that I was in hospital, they would just leave me there and hope I'd get over it. I have actually signed myself out of the hospital because they were not willing to provide me any treatment, and I was getting better care at home, and that was purely policy based. It also had things to do with the weekend skeleton crew of staff they would have and no doctors around to intervene. But it was usually because they couldn't tell us what it was. It wasn't a matter of waiting for the tests. When they sent off samples, they said they didn't know what it was. So that they explain it is because your HIV is so bizarre in what it can allow to happen to you, we can't diagnose every illness that we come across. So they would then not treat us. And in my case, they didn't treat me several times. And I essentially just about got through what I was dealing with at those times. That I can tell you that happened 4 times. I can remember distinctly when they couldn't diagnose what had happened to me. It was some kind of infection. I was coughing my guts out, not just coughing, but literally bringing things up. And there was nothing that they were able or willing to do.
In July of 2005, you were diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma cancer in your chest.
Yes.
And you understand that to be a direct result is it of the hepatitis C?
Hep C.
Or both infections?
It has to be related to the Hep C, but it could have had an impact from both because of my immune system being shot to pieces. So, although I did naturally clear the virus, the Hep C virus by that time, I found out later it is one of the things that Hep C can lead to. And as regards the Skipton Fund, it's one of the illnesses that they accept that you will and can suffer having been infected with the Hep C as well. So I believe it to be very much related to the Hep C. And obviously my HIV impacts everything.
You had to undergo chemotherapy.
Yes.
Because of the B-cell lymphoma. And you started that pretty much straight away after the diagnosis in July.
Yes, as soon as they could get me into it. I had to have 5 courses of the chemotherapy. I was supposed to have 6, but the sixth course, during the testing, they said that the levels of the test that they were doing, which was showing how stable my own condition was, if I'd had the 6th set, it would have killed me. So I was unable to have the 6th set, and they basically just had to wing it whether I would get through it or not. They didn't know whether I would survive it because the cancer I had was, when they started the chemo, it was 11 centimetres across inside my chest. They said it was like a large orange in there. And the chemo I was doing was both intravenous and also through lumbar punctures into my spine. And each time I went there were 5 sets that I had, and I believe 3 of them were lumbar punctures. So later on, we'll explain that had its problems, it caused problems for me later. But I did get through it, but it was blind luck. They said that it wasn't. They weren't even remotely sure it would be enough, because it wasn't gone by the fifth stage. But fortunately enough, it shrunk enough after that 5th stage for me to get away with not having the last cycle.
In terms of treatment for HIV, you're on a triple therapy treatment, but you have had problems with the treatment over recent years because you've become resistant to particular medications, and the combinations have had to be changed.
Yes, I'm told there are 4 groups of treatment that can be provided. That's not for independent drugs, it's groups of drugs. And I am now resistant to one whole section and then half of another section. So as I explained to you, what that means to me is I'm running out of options. It means that I keep becoming more and more resistant to what is available, and that cuts down what they're able to treat me with. It doesn't matter what drugs are available if you're resistant to those drugs, because it won't work anymore. So, yes, I do feel like I'm running out of time, if you like, as regards what will help me suppress the virus.
And you've had experienced side effects from the drugs in previous years.
I've had some amazingly difficult times, having been taken off one drug that they call getting old or less efficient, often because they're saying I'm beginning to become slightly resistant to it, and they have a newer drug that they think will work better. One of the episodes I had with that was I developed a major form of migraine because I'd just gone on to this one new drug, and it was called efavirenz, and I developed an immense type of migraine that initially floored me. I then had to be taken back to the QE. They booked me in, and they had to take me off my pills under my insistence that this new pill had to be why. There is a culture of don't be silly, it can't be the drugs do no wrong within hospitals. They're very positive towards the forms of treatment you're on. But I was adamant, because it was the only new thing I'd done, that it had to be that. And they did take me off the drug, and although I did have one additional spike of the major migraine, I'm lying in the hospital bed with a latex glove filled with ice on my head, just so that I can open my eyes. And I was like that for days. And although it flared up once more, once they took me off that drug, it went away. So we confirmed that I couldn't tolerate that drug. And this was all about trying to modernise the treatment that I was on when they were moving things around and changing what drugs I was on. Some of it is because I've become resistant to other forms. Some it's because these were newer drugs at the time. But yes, I've had major problems with a lot of the drugs, even the more recent times. And
to the extent that there was a approximately 5-year period, 2000 to 2005, when you took no HIV medication at all.
I decided to come off the treatment at that time because I was being beaten up far too much by the treatment. I was zombified by it. It was so aggressive that I had no life because of it. The only way I can explain to you, it was like going on holiday. As soon as I come off the treatment, which I did, I decided I just couldn't continue taking things that were being so hostile. And it was against my doctor's advice at the time, but I told them, this is wiping me out. And I had to come off it. And I was off treatment for 5 years. And during that time, believe it or not, it was completely free, and it was like I was a different person. It's only then that I realised how badly affected I was on the treatments.
You went back on to HIV treatment in 2005 because you met your partner, now wife. And
what happened was basically simply because I met my wife, my equation, let me put it that way, in my mind changed completely. All of a sudden, it becomes about protecting someone else. That's all I was concerned about. So I'd basically somewhat given up prior to that. I'd had enough. But when I met, I needed to change what I was doing, because it then isn't just about me. Even if we're not together, it affects someone else directly. So there was a massive need to change what I was doing.
You've talked in your statement about how, and we've touched on it already, but I just wanted to ask you a little more, how you lived life like a hermit.
Yeah.
As a form of self-protection. You would push friends away because you feared things would go wrong for them.
Yeah, every time I had made friends, eventually I became a burden to them. At school I didn't really make that many friends, but I was always one of the disabled kids in the class, so everybody was nice to you. But after school, when you're developing your own friends, whenever they would arrange to do anything or go anywhere, I'd be invited because I was part of their group, but in some way I'd ruin it. Something would always happen that either stopped me going there, or I would break whilst with them and be a burden because they were trying, for example, just normally going out with people, I am physically breaking down and they're having to rush to where they're going and I'm slowing everybody down. But I'm also carrying, if we went anywhere big, I'm carrying lots of medication with me as well, which doubles the workload for everyone. And I have gone to places where my friends have had to pack all my gear away because I've been taken away in an ambulance and they've been left to clean up my mess. So whenever I would try to go anywhere with anyone, something about my health would destroy everything. So I ended up basically just not interacting with everybody because I am a problem to everyone. So I spent years just in my bedroom, staying there because it was the least problem I was.
You've been with your wife now for a number of years.
Yes,
And-
that
and-
did change my life significantly
You've
with that
described
support.
You've described her as a godsend to you. She's taken on trying to get you out,
Yes,
and getting you to interact more, but you still don't leave the house unless you're with her.
that's it. I still am only interacting with outside because I'm taken to places and it's very purposeful. It's still not let's go and have a nice time because, well, apart from my social problems because of isolating myself for so long and the reasoning behind having to have a social worker because I interact badly, because I spent years being really locked away, so I don't friendship well, if you want to put it that way. There's so many problems that I'm dealing with that whenever I go anywhere, it's designed behind get what you're going to do and then come back. And when my wife's tried to make it so that I could be more outgoing, but I'm still immensely reluctant all the time because I'm expecting problems all the time. Even doing this has been a huge, stressful task. So we never know what's coming. I've got a whole suitcase full of medical equipment, full of just in case possibilities, just because I've come to this. And I'm always thinking about the times when I've gone places and that's resulted in, just because I went, I've ended up in hospital. Whether it's because I'm interacting with people and picking things up, or whether it is the other side, which is the haemophilia side, with your body breaking down because you're trying to do what everybody else is doing. That led to me using a mobility scooter, which we'll talk about.
And you've said in your statement that when you and your wife do go out, it's really, as well as having a purpose to it, it's a short trip, so you'll be going to the bank or the shopping centre and then you go back home.
It's like a straight line journey. And I know that that's difficult for me because I would prefer to explore more, but I don't want to be there. I'm always thinking back to safe zone. So it's always been socially really awkward and difficult. And the more I know that it's because of the way I close myself off but it's the only way to explain it is it's the only place everything is safe. I can deal with what happens to me so long as it's just me. But when it's affecting other people, I become immensely strained by it.
And the fact that you have made a much longer journey to come here to give evidence is a very unusual occurrence for you.
Yes, yeah, I don't normally go out. When my wife goes out for herself with her friends, whenever it is arranged for them, I don't go with her, and I don't interact with anyone. I had friend groups, but over time, every time you dent what they're doing because you become ill in the middle of it and then just become a problem, you stop being willing to burden them with what you deal with. I've ruined several trips for a lot of people, including my parents, trying to carry me as part of whatever your group is, whether it was my family or those friends I had back then, eventually erodes their ability to, well, it really erodes my willingness to put them through it. And eventually I just gave up on it all and shut myself away.
One of the individuals who's been very important to you in terms of providing you with practical support and assistance is the social worker who you've mentioned. And your statement describes a number of significant practical interventions by the social worker Mark Simmons, based at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, from helping you to get a flat that you and your wife could move into together, through to assisting you with applications to the schemes, which we'll come back to.
Yes.
And providing general everyday support and advice.
Yes, my social worker was golden. He was the only way for me to have any kind of independence, because I boxed myself into a single room box, and his entire motivation was trying to help me out of that cage I put myself in. And he not only helped me with my wife, but it started well before that. From the age of 17 onwards, when I first met him, he saw immediately that I was hiding from the world and tried to get me to interact in a normal way with it. He encouraged me into college, and we did that for a few months until that was beaten up by my health. My health collapsed that idea too. Every time he's tried to do it, it's also gone wrong. But he was immensely vigilant and kept helping me with the normal instructions of what you do to have a normal life as an adult. And obviously, because I'm not outside interacting with other people, I'm not learning life skills. So he had to basically tutor me, even down to basic fillings of forms of living in a home. What do you do? Where do you send things? Who do you get that information from? It was all having to come through my social worker, aside from trying to deal with the schemes to do with this, which has been a nightmare in itself.
In terms of family life, you have decided that you do not feel able to have children.
No.
And you've put it in this way in your statement. My child not only could have haemophilia, but could also carry and have to suffer the viruses, and would still have to deal with a father that's a complete mess, a broken, diseased thing. That's no life for any child. I would just never want to put any child through that.
I know some people would see that as unfair, because a lot of people have gone on to have families, but you tend to look internally and see nothing but episodes of trauma you cause everybody else. All of it, really, in your own mindset, you're used to damage. That's what we do as haemophiliacs. But with things like the viruses, when you become really sick, it's abnormal. So everybody, they see you bleeding and you've been dealing with that. So everybody knows he's going to sort that out. He's going to get over the bleeding and he's going to be okay. But when you become sick, everybody is intensely frightened because you expect to die because you keep hearing that everybody else did. Your cousin did. My cousin died, and that was a random, what started out as a small thing. He was just a little bit snivelly. And then very soon after, he died of double pneumonia. So every time something happens like that, you affect everyone else. So when I'm thinking of things like children, all I can see is what dealing with me would be for, even if the kid was healthy. And I don't want to put anybody else through what I've done. I just don't.
You've talked in your statement, as well as the assistance you received from the haemophilia unit-based social worker, you also received assistance from the haemophilia unit community nurse, but that certainly at the time you were drafting your statement, you said that both those positions were currently unfilled at the haemophilia unit due to financial and staffing issues.
Yes, it's both that the social worker I had to retire because he wasn't well. And the main problem that they've suffered is the position of being a social worker to us is so immensely complicated that they can't actually train someone to deal with the years of information that they need to absorb to deal with both the illnesses we have, but the trusts that are associated with our support, as well as having to deal with our disability benefits, such as the PIP changes, as well as any understanding of grants that we might be able to get help from things like the council. All of that information, plus the medical damages that we've sustained, becomes impossible for somebody to be trained. That's how it's been explained to me. They can't train someone with all that information, and each time they've tried, the person they were trying to get to do it has gone away. But they're also under the pressure all the time of, because they haven't filled the position, the overheads of the unit, who not those who run the unit, but those who fund it, say, well, clearly you're not using one, so you don't need one, so we want to close the position down. So for at least 10 years, they've been under threat of losing not just those positions. The community nurse at the moment is gone because of the staffing level has been taken away. So they don't have anybody who can act as the community nurse anymore. And the social worker became ill and was never replaced. And that left people like me lost, completely lost. Because all of the information of finding out how to interact with the rest of the world came through my social worker. And they won't replace them. And it's been like that now for years.
To just ask you a little about the litigation in which your parents were involved on your behalf, and the issue of financial assistance.
Okay.
Your father and mother, I think, wrote, as we've seen in 1986, to your local MP, and continued to raise matters of concern with your local MP. And if one at least of those letters was passed to the then Minister for Health, Virginia Bottomley. We just have up on screen the response your MP received. It's 0008003. It's a letter 16th of November 1990 from Virginia Bottomley, and so it's at the time of the court action, the HIV haemophilia litigation. Says this: thank you for your letter the 29th of October, enclosing one from Mr. and Mrs. X about the current court action concerning haemophiliacs who've contracted the AIDS virus. First, there's no argument about the scale of the tragedy or the desperate plight of haemophiliacs infected with the HIV/AIDS virus. It's difficult to find words to describe the depth of the distress which both they and their families must be experiencing. The government has never disputed our moral responsibility to pay attention to the needs of the victims and their families. We have quite uniquely paid haemophiliacs with HIV at least £20,000 each to help with their problems, and we have paid more in cases of hardship. We have also always promised to keep the sums available to the Macfarlane Trust and the needs of haemophiliacs under review. Despite our promise to keep under review the £34 million already made available, many haemophiliacs have decided to pursue legal proceedings, alleging negligence against the last government, the present government, the licensing authorities, the health authorities and the doctors who treated them. On the information before me, I have no grounds for conceding that the tragedy was the fault of the NHS, all of this or previous governments. She then talks about concepts of no-fault compensation. And then if we go over the page, please, says this: there have been no substantial changes in the basic arguments since then. While no-fault schemes remove the perceived unfairness between those who can prove negligence and those who cannot, they create unfairness between those disabled as a result of a so-called medical accident and those who are equally disabled through natural causes. They also generally result in individual claimants receiving much smaller amounts of compensation than would be awarded through the courts in cases where negligence could be proved. And then she says this: our NHS is greatly threatened by the increase in the number of writs that are being issued claiming compensation for allegations of medical negligence. The American healthcare system is being ruined by excessive litigation and the mounting costs of compensation. It is possible to organise powerful emotional campaigns for many groups whose treatment has failed to restore good health. All medical treatment has an element of risk and involves considered judgments of those risks in the light of current scientific knowledge. I am sorry if this is a disappointing reply, but the government is showing its great concern for haemophiliacs with HIV by the ex gratia payments it is making. I am afraid that the question of compensation has to remain a matter for the courts to decide if some of the haemophiliacs insist on pressing their legal claim to a court hearing. You wanted to draw that letter to the intention of the inquiry and exhibited it to your statement. You have, I think, and you've expressed them in your statement, views on the amounts of money that were or were not made available to individuals through the ex gratia payment scheme.
Yes. To begin with, I'd like to point out that I see them as radically unfair, if I understand them correctly, that someone who was a child would not have received as much as someone who was an adult or an adult with children, because it doesn't account for the fact that we, apart from the government's point of view that we're all going to die in 5 years, which was thrown around at the time, you would expect that we would grow up to become adults and then expect to try to put some kind of life together that may include a partner and for many may include children. But if we're to get less because we're children at the time than people who are already adults, it just seems completely unfair. And obviously the first thing everybody's going to say is, essentially, my cousin is put to death for what amounts to £20,000. And there isn't a soul on this planet that would put up with that being told that's what your life's worth. Nobody would have that. Just in general, the idiocy of the figure that they say makes up for what was done for us, to us, is absurd in itself. But then to treat us as children as somehow less worth than those who are already adults, although I I accept that they have other responsibilities, but we as children were going to become adults and have those problems and responsibilities ourselves. So the idea that you could give less to us because we were children just seems incredibly unfair. And it seems deliberately divisive between the groups of victims. And you then, I'm not going to call at any time becoming resentful of any other victims in other situations. That's not where we come from. But it's whenever anything has been arranged for any kind of payment system, there are always ways that divide us into groups that end up being unfair figures. It's from the litigation at the start to the support systems later on, where they separate off widows from what they call primary infected victims. There's always differences in the way they'll fund it, or huge differences in the amounts that you're allowed to get. And it's all almost to divide and antagonise, and ultimately to try to save money.
You've made a number of observations in your statement about the schemes and indeed your own experiences with the schemes, and I'm just going to draw out some of the themes from that and ask you about them. You've just touched on one of them, which was the cessation of payments after death.
Yes. One of the most vulgar things that you have to deal with when you're applying to the trusts is their stance when a primary beneficiary dies. Basically, after 1 year of the payments, after 1 year after your death, they stop all payments to your family. And they basically cross your name off a list, say he's not alive anymore, so we don't have to pay them. It doesn't matter what happens to them now. And I've always found that to be amazingly unfair, because you leave a family in immense grief. I know this for a fact, because I know that my aunt would have been essentially cut off because of the policies made up by these so-called supportive trust funds. And I'm left watching that and thinking, every time you've paid me, that means something that you've refused to pay the families of those who've died. So they will be left with nothing but their grief, their anger, and their pain, with no support whatsoever. So no, it's not okay that entire groups get completely cut off from systems that claim they're there to support the victims, even though all of those victims, whether they're parents, widows, or you as a primary infected person, are all supposed to be named in the deed of the trusts themselves. It was supposed to be set up to support haemophiliacs that had been infected with the HIV virus, in the case of the Macfarlane Trust, who had been infected via blood products from the NHS, but also to their families, the families of those people who'd been infected. So your parents were were named specifically as supposed to be supported. The widows were supposed to be supported, all in this deed. And yet, the trust itself, when you get into what happens when you die, cuts them off. And I don't understand how that's okay.
And in that regard, you've also drawn attention in your statement to disparities between the current system and the position in Scotland.
Yes. When the change to the EIBSS was proposed, we were sent letters which amounted to the Macfarlane Trust pleading for its life, really. But what they were highlighting was, if it comes to pass that this new scheme is set up, it had been found out by the Haemophilia Society as well that the Scottish system would pay a great deal more both to primary beneficiaries and to widowed beneficiaries in the amounts. The Scottish system would pay a hell of a lot more than per month in their payments than would happen in the English system. So basically you're getting a lot less money if you live in England just because you live in England. And I also understand that the Scottish system proposed that widows would get, I believe it said 75% of, at the time this was all being proposed, the payments of a primary beneficiary, and as an ongoing payment, acknowledging that the dead victim was a living person who had a right to life. So at least their family would be receiving something that could help them through not just their grief, but their financial hardship, losing somebody who, essentially, we all received money, so it could stabilise our lives. So when we are dead, that's suddenly gone as well from that family. So in Scotland, they would receive that 75% of the payment. As I've said before, I will not get into whether the amounts are acceptable. I'm talking about them receiving a payment that can keep them perhaps financially stable through their grief. But in England, you get a one-off payment when you die under the new scheme. It's not just that they cut you off. There's a one-off payment, it's a small amount. I believe it's something like £10,000, and then that's it. Forget about you. It doesn't matter who the person was that died. So in England, it's completely unfair compared with an ongoing payment that happens in Scotland. And the difference between the two is just brutally unfair. So I don't see anything as more wrong.
You have some particular concerns about the processes and transparency of those processes that you've identified in your statement. You've talked in your statement about how in the early years of the McFarlane Trust, your mother wasn't made aware of the possibility of applying for grants, and it was only later when the social worker that you've mentioned told you, and told you also that he'd had to tell a number of people about the availability of those grants.
Yes, we had no idea, and I say we because I didn't have a clue either. My mother wasn't told they did a wide range of grants. We're talking about when I'm 17. When I first met this social worker who has enlightened me to the fact that we haven't received any support from what they call the grant system within the McFarlane Trust, despite the fact that apparently we were supposed to be able to access this ever since the MFT had been put in place. So my parents had done without grants. My mother said she did once find out that they did a washing machine, but when they applied for it, it was made absolute hell for them for having to jump through hoops to try to qualify. And in the end, they gave up. It was over. So from that point onwards, and that would be in the very early days of the trust, both my mother and father had no idea that they even did the wide range of grants that were available when we met Mark. And he had to educate me into not just how many things that we'd been doing without, that my parents should have been receiving as support all that time. And my parents were poor. My father worked for like £40 a day. So it would have made a massive difference to them, and they just weren't made aware of it. So when my social worker introduced me into it, he had to teach me what you had to do to apply for what was a wide range of different grants. It was never immense amounts of money, but it was helpful if you don't have any. So at that time, it wasn't too difficult to apply. You just then had to provide things like a lot of receipts and sometimes slightly absurd levels of receipts to prove that you'd spent the money correctly because you weren't trusted. But it was support that my parents were essentially denied whilst looking after me as a child. They didn't know because no one told them. The trust itself never told anyone that these grant systems existed, and that left them not knowing they should have been getting support. So I feel bad for my mum and dad, and I know that my aunt would have been cut out of any of that as well because my cousin died in 92.
You had particular difficulties when you made an application to the McFarlane Trust in 2015 for funding for a mobility scooter.
Yes.
Your statement explains. You say that was the most difficult experience you've ever had with the McFarlane Trust. You had to get medical letters to verify your need for the scooter, which you got, but your application was still turned down.
Yes.
And turned down on the basis that other organisations, such as the local authority, should fund this.
The initial one, it ended up being a 3-year battle in total, which crossed over between when the McFarlane Trust was taken over by the EIBSS. I initially applied under the McFarlane Trust rules during a period where they had made the ability to qualify for a grant a hell of a lot stricter under an undefinable phrase of exceptional circumstances, which they refused to define to us. Bear in mind, by this time, I have been dealing with the McFarlane Trust for a long time at that point. I believe we were in 2000.
Your statement suggests it was 2015
that's
when
correct,
you made
yes.
your application for assistance.
So by 2015, we'd gone through a big change in the scheme where we had gotten the MFET payments, which were direct and automatic. But because they were direct and automatic payments, it was felt by the powers that be that we just shouldn't need the grants anymore and should stop getting them all the time. So they made it immensely difficult for anyone to get any access to a grant. But then we're still being told, these grants are there for you. We do grants for mobility equipment. We do grants for medical modifications to your home for disability needs. So I applied because I developed a lot of trouble from dealing with the cancer. I'll explain why as I get to the later stage, but I applied to them because they told me this was available for us and I had lost my mobility. So I was saying that surely that demonstrates exceptional circumstances if I can no longer walk around anymore. But because they wouldn't define what exceptional circumstances meant, they would say, not good enough. And during that time, they outright refused me anyway, even though I had sent them the medical letters from the haemophilia unit, because what had happened, it would be sent directly by the unit because it had to be written and signed by the consultant by that time. And they sent it by email to the McFarlane Trust, and the McFarlane Trust said, yes, you have apparently medical supporting letters, but you can't have the grant because you won't give us your outgoings. Now, we would get grants for years, having only ever given them our income to prove our income, which I always did. But suddenly they introduced a rule where they wanted your outgoings as well. And because they'd never needed it, I refused to accept that they actually needed that information to grant a grant. They had the medical information, which is what I was saying. I am in medical need of this equipment, and you have medical proof that I am in medical need of this equipment. you don't need to know anymore. And I was saying that because I don't believe it's acceptable for me to be means tested out of support from a medical disaster charity.
Your application in relation to the mobility scooter went back and forth, essentially.
I sent it back to them 4 times at that time.
And they still said no, and eventually you got so desperate that you funded the purchase of the mobility scooter yourself.
I actually had to buy it by the second time of asking, because regardless of the trust, I am in medical need of this equipment. That's got nothing to do with whether they will pay it, and with all the grants, it's the case that we as victims can't wait 3 months for them to make up their mind if we deserve it or if we need it. We need it for medical reasons, and we've got medical letters telling the hospitals, telling them that we medically need it. So what happens in reality is we have to buy this equipment and we have to start using it, whether they've made their mind up or not. But their response to that was always, well, you've purchased it now, that makes it retrospective, so we're not paying for it now anyway.
You applied again for a mobility scooter grant 3 years later in 2018 to EIBSS, because you wanted a machine that you could fold away and put in a car.
Yeah, so after the 4th time of asking through the MFT, I gave up on that. I'd been trying to get it from them for something like 2.5 years, and then it was all changed over to the EIBSS. I had given up by that point. I'd bought it anyway, the one I was able to use. I'd bought a larger machine because I needed to be able to get from my house to places, and we'd always had a car that could take a larger machine at that point. But that then became a new series of problems. My actual machine that I got stopped being usable for certain scenarios. What essentially happened is my wife took ill and I had to look after her in the hospital, and I was unable to get the scooter I had into any car because I can't drive to get to her. Although our car could fit it, I can't drive. So I needed a travel option to be able to both look after my wife, but at the same time look after myself. Essentially, I asked them, because the EIBSS once more said, we've got a new set of grants that are available, again, including mobility equipment. So I said, okay, then you're doing grants again. I'm going to ask you for what I've now experienced that I need, because I injured myself quite badly trying to look after my wife. I applied to them and sent, again, medical supported letters. Again, the unit is, although overworked, being asked for these letters all the time, they fully supported it because they saw the mess I got myself into. And I was essentially told, you're a haemophiliac, and because you're a haemophiliac, that's why you need it. So you can't have it because it's nothing to do with your HIV status. I was banned from accessing the disability grants because I was a haemophiliac, despite the whole reason they were set up was supposed to be to support us haemophiliacs that had been infected. So I was furious. So every time I tried, whether it was with the Macfarlane Trust, around this scooter that I had a lot of need for it. The reason it mattered so much to me is it's the one grant where I had exceptional need in a life-changing problem that I needed this equipment, and I had absolutely everybody vouching for me that I needed it, and it was the only thing I could do, and yet I'm being banned from access for a multitude of reasons, but the most insulting one is because I'm a haemophiliac. They said in the new scheme they'd set up that you have to prove that it's related to your HIV status or your Hep C status or the treatment of those two illnesses.
And ultimately, you were able to satisfy that more restrictive criteria.
They were still wrong, because what actually happened to me is when I had the cancer, while I was doing the chemo, I had to have lumbar puncture chemotherapy injected into my spine. And on the third time they did my lumbar punctures, it went kind of badly. And they had to attempt it 7 times. And it's that's led to me having a lot of trouble with my back that finally put me in a position, after years of bleeding from that damaged location, which was directly associated with my cancer, which was related to the viruses, that led to me needing the scooter in the first place. So I basically had to send a 19-page complaint explaining to them that haemophilia, for a start, does not cause damage. It is the effect of an injury that took place because of the cause of something else, whether it's an accident or whether it's a fall or whether it's a medical procedure, such as it was in my case. Wherever the locations are, haemophilia is a consequence of that. I started having to explain that to them, and then explain to them what really caused the damage, which was the damage from the chemo after having the cancer, which over years has caused me loads of bleeding in what's become, in haemophilia terms, they call it a weak point in either one of your joints or a location in your body where you bleed from an awful lot, and it's persistent. So I had to explain that to them, and eventually, because I schooled them, I actually got the scooter in the end. But it was like I was at war with them for 3.5 years just for one grant. But that's not the only problem I had with these grants. During the time I was talking about, when I applied for the scooter the first time, I had 4 rejected, all for the same reasons, because I wouldn't give them my outgoings, which I knew that they had no right to base their grants, the decisions on, because they had no right to that information in the first place. Neither did they have the ability to check anybody's financial status, so they couldn't base their decisions on it, because anybody could just make them up.
The 2 other particular issues you had with the application processes that I wanted to ask you about, firstly, was about your attempt to get the stage 2 payment, which took, again, a significant period of time, and you ultimately got it from EIBSS,
Yes.
not having managed to get it through Skipton.
So, when Skipton first was introduced, I believe that was around 2005, and at that time, I understand everybody that had been infected with Hep C was put through with the Macfarlane Trust liaising with the hospitals about all the patients they knew about. And as it was set up, we were all put through it, and our medical records were checked, and then, in my case, I was put on stage 1 at that time. At that time, the stage 1 payment was only a one-off payment, which they gave to me, and then I essentially didn't hear anything else about it for a long time. So I was considered to be on stage 1 until 2018, because I didn't know any different. In 2018, what had happened previously, in 2016, they added a stage 1 monthly payment, which was low. It was like £3,000 annually, but it was something, and I was put on the stage 1 payment. However, in 2018, I received a letter which was about what they were calling a special category mechanism letter, which explained that they were adding new illnesses to the qualifying criteria for stage 2 for the Skipton payments. In that letter, that wasn't associated to the new illnesses new illnesses they'd added, it said anybody that had suffered a B-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma will already be on stage 2. When I read that, obviously I said, but I'm not. And I immediately took that to the hospital and asked them, am I reading that correctly? Is that what that says? And they said they read it the same way I did. So I had to call them up and find out how to apply for stage 2 because I'd suffered the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I then went back through the paperwork I did have from the original explanation of what Skipton was from the 2005, which I keep records of everything. Also saw that I had no information about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma now qualifying, but they told me when I asked them that was added in 2011. And they said that coincided with the stage 2 payments becoming monthly payments. So basically I had to reapply to the Skipton scheme to try to get put on the stage 2 payments. I had all my medical letters arranged by the hospital again, using the notes from when I was treated for the cancer in 2005-06. They sent that to the Skipton Fund, and they said, we see you do actually qualify for Skipton Stage 2, and that will mean that you'll receive the one-off payment for being on Stage 2, which was a £50,000 one-off payment, and that means you also qualify for the monthly payments for Stage 2, which is much higher. I believe that's the same payment as for HIV under the new scheme. I think that's £15,000 per year. So they said, so you do qualify for that, and we can see you've qualified for it since, well, it will be since 2005-06 when you've suffered the cancer, but the actual payments, the monthly payments, weren't introduced until 2011. So we can only do that from then. However, they said, actually, we know you qualified from then, but we're only going to pay you from 2018 onwards, from when you applied, because that's the way it works. We can't back pay you. So this meant to me a difference of, I think it was £94,000 that I would have gotten from 2011, because they'd explained how long I would have received the payments for. And they said, but they're not paying it. They won't back pay it. So I had to, again, go back to the earliest paperwork I had, where it said that I could force them to have it reviewed in a court, a judicial review, I think it was called, of the decision. And it wasn't until I actually threatened to take them to court about this decision. They said I qualified, and they themselves had said I'd qualified since 2006, but they weren't going to back pay me to the 2011 when they told me the payments I should have been receiving had started from.
And your statement explains that it was once you'd threatened to take them to court, you say, you got the letter that said that they would make the back payment to 2011. I already
had received, once I'd qualified, they sent me a letter that said that I did qualify from the period I explained when I had the cancer, but they would only pay me from 2018 onwards in the first letter they sent me. And it was that I challenged. And I went back to them and told them, that can't be right. You've already qualified me from that period. You can't disqualify me for a period you yourselves have just qualified me for. You telling me I was entitled to it from that point, so you can't take it away from me. And I said that I wanted them to do this court review of my application, because it was unfair. And It wasn't until I actually threatened to take them to court that they suddenly sent me another letter saying, actually, we will back pay it, and we'll back pay it all back to 2011, like you are correct that you are owed. So again, it's like you can never get what you're supposed to be entitled to until you reach such a point that you're willing to take them to court to get it. And that, in that case, I went that far because it was an extraordinary amount of money. So if I hadn't challenged them about that, I wouldn't have received it. If I'd just swallowed that, I'd have lost £94,000. And I'm sure there's many others who haven't known or haven't had the old paperwork that established that you had the right to challenge them, who they've told the same thing to. I know that there are others who've tried to get the same things I have, such as the scooter, and that was refused to those people as well. But because I fight them about things, I've eventually got through to them. But in that case, literally having to threaten to take them to court, and then all of a sudden they decide, actually, you were always entitled to it, we were just trying to stop you getting it. It's absurd, and it's obstructive, and every element of the support systems is designed to stop you getting access rather than to support you. And I've experienced it over and over again.
Mr. AI, those are the questions I had for you. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Okay. One of the things I do need to say, it does relate to the potential consequences of the inquiry itself. It's pretty much been established that the government keeps saying that it doesn't really want to pay out compensation. So I just want to put it on record that the government seems to have a financial incentive not to pay out to us, because their current situation in all the schemes is if we die, the way they've written the stipulations, the payouts stop. So essentially, it's better for them if they wait for us to die. That can't be allowed to continue. If there is going to be any kind of, whether you call it compensation or whether you don't call it compensation and they just raise the support payments, they have to make it, someone has to make it so that they're not allowed to only deliver them to the people that are still alive. Because while they only have to pay out to people who are still alive, they can always keep refusing to pay it, hoping that we'll die off so that they can save money. It has to be paid out in the names of the victims that have died as well, to the next of kin of those victims and the families that were also immensely damaged. I know their deed said in the McFarlane Trust's deed that those people were supposed to be being supported every bit as much as we were as primary infected, in my case kids, but infected haemophiliacs. Someone needs to clarify that it's not okay for you only to support the ones that are still alive, because when the victims have died, their families are devastated. They're going through financial hardship as well as the grief, but the government is saying, we don't need to support them anymore. That person died, cross them off the list. Their life doesn't matter. The fact that they were killed doesn't matter. The hell with them. That can't be allowed to carry on. So whatever is done must include widows. There's a major problem around where there were parents, because they didn't necessarily call them widows. So parents weren't really thought of within the schemes in a way. There were some payments that some widows could get access to through the MFT, but they were minuscule. But there were no categories for parents, even though many of us were children when we were infected, and when we died when we were young, they will always be classed as your next of kin, and yet there was no category to help them. So whatever happens in the compensation system, it has to include the families of those that have died in the name of the person who was infected and who has died, because otherwise the government still has a financial incentive not to pay out, because it's just waiting for us to die off to reduce how much it costs. It's just not right.
Thank you. Thank you. Sir.
Mr. AI, during the course of your evidence, you said how you described yourself to yourself as a broken, diseased thing. Let me tell you, I do not see you that way. I rather see somebody who, despite having the fears that you have, despite never coming out of your house except to go to particular events for a short time, and despite having the fears of anonymity that you have been prepared to come here for the length of time that you have, to give us the full value of your experiences and thoughts which you have, despite your saying that you have no social skills, mainly about other people and how things might be improved for them. And for that, and for what you've told us, I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you as well.
Now, tomorrow.
Sir, tomorrow we hear in the morning from Susan Delglean and Tara Allen, and then from Janice Whitehorn Cox, and then we have 2 anonymous witnesses.
Thank you. And we start at 10.
Yes.
So tomorrow, at that stage, in relation to tomorrow, as you leave, you may find that there is a leaflet of information which is handed out. Please read it and take note if you're intending to be here tomorrow. Thank you very much.